Good evening. This is the second of the series of A Rock and a Hard Place that the Thetford Historical Society is presenting every Thursday. Next Thursday at the Church on the Hill, Tim Jennings, who is a wonderful storyteller, will be sharing with you a bunch of Vermont folk tales and traditional stories from Vermont and New England. The following Thursday, which is April the 27th, and that'll be in the Thetford Center Community Building, Marty Podskich will talk about the history of the Civilian Conservation Corps in Vermont, but there's also a specific Thetford reference to that. And then the last one, first Thursday in May 4th, we'll be back here. Jill Mudgett will be talking about murder in the Vermont woods, and she'll be talking about mysteries, and they're all good. Don't miss any of them. There is somewhere a sign-up sheet that's going to be handed around. It will be handed to you. Just please sign up if you want to be on the mailing list. I think there's a spot to put your email address. So tonight, it is my privilege to introduce to you Kevin Gardner. Like a lot of independent rural Yankees, Kevin is a jack of many trades. He's a builder, logger, writer, teacher, radio voice, actor, director. And for more than 40 years, he's been a stonewall builder. He works in a family business which is widely known for traditional New England stonework, particularly for historic restoration of antique structures. He has with him two of the books that he's written. One is called The Granite Kiss, Traditions and Techniques of Building New England Stone Walls. The other is Stone Building, How to Make New England Style Walls and Other Structures the Old Way. He tells me if you ask nicely, he will even sign it for you as long as you pay for it. And he's also published poetry and essays and songs, including Land of Stone, which is an examination of several historic sites in the Monadnock Region in the 2006 anthology, Where the Mountain Stands Alone. So with no further ado, Kevin Gardner. Thank you for being
here. Well, good evening. It's so nice to see you all here. It's always a dicey proposition to get people to come out of their houses. I know this from personal experience. And so I'm really grateful not only to Brigitte, but also to all the members of the Society and any guests who happen to be here for coming out tonight. Very nice of you to come. I'm going to give you a historical overview of our New England stone walls. I'm going to say a few things about how they're made and how their styles emerged and changed over time. I'd like to bring you up to date on where this craft is at the present time. And I'm going to do this as fast as I can because I want to get to the part of the program that's always my favorite, and that is answering any questions that you have, or if you have any observations to make about your own surroundings or mysterious things you've seen, or if I've simply gone past some of this information a little too fast and you'd like some elaboration on it, please don't hesitate to take me back to any place where you'd like to have that. But I'm going to begin with a public service announcement and a disclaimer. The public service announcement is this: I am not looking for work. And the disclaimer is this: if you happen to be sitting in a place where you can't really see what I am doing on this tabletop while I talk to you, please don't worry about it. It's got nothing at all to do with what I'm talking about. But I'm going to begin with a particular year, a very important year in the history of New England stone wall building, as it turns out. That year was 1871. In 1871, our beloved U.S. Department of Agriculture decided it would be a super idea to take inventory of all the fencing in the United States. So, contemplate that for a moment. They worked on this terribly important project for about a year, and then released an enormous report full of many facts. Among them was this one: that in these 6 New England states and the state of New York combined, in other words, the northeast corner of the United States, there were more than 250,000 miles of stone wall. 250,000 miles of stone wall is more stone wall than there is railroad track in this country. It is more stone wall than the entire length of the U.S. coastline. It is enough stone wall, go all the way around the world 10 times. It's even enough. This is the last statistic. It's even enough to stretch from the parking lot outside this pretty little building to the surface of the moon. There are two notable things about this number. First one is, it's wrong. It's too low by a long way. And that's because the federal report on fencing only concerned itself with what it said it concerned itself with, which was fences, barriers between sections of farmland. But anybody who's been in New England for about 15 minutes knows that there are a great many more things built out of what we call dry-laid stone. That is to say, stone structures that are held together by nothing more than their own weight and the skill of the person who puts them there. Many more things built this way than merely fencing. They include ramps and causeways, stone-lined wells, the old town pounds, and of course, thousands and thousands of foundations under houses, barns, buildings of all kinds. Taken together with the straightforward 250,000 miles plus of dry-laid stone fence, it's been estimated by some who perhaps became overstimulated by this number that there is more dry-laid stone wall in the Northeast United States than there is in the entire rest of the world combined. This is not an assertion I'm personally prepared to back up. But just the fact that somebody made this statement should tell you something about the almost incredible communal architectural accomplishment that these walls and other structures represent. The second notable thing about this number really has not much to do with the number itself, but rather with the year that it was arrived at. Because if you could pick a year in which we reached a kind of tipping point in this country and began to lose more stone wall than we were gaining, you could do much worse than catch up on 1871. By that time, a kind of confluence of events that had been building throughout the 19th century came to a head, if you will, and put an end to the long decades of concentration on the creation of a viable agricultural infrastructure in this part of the world. The end of building stone walls, as far as the farmers were concerned anyway, came about for many reasons. One of them was, of course, the Civil War, which took a great many farmers off their land, sent them off to fight. Many of them did not return, of course, but among those who did, many of those had found that there are places in this country where the topsoil is 6 feet deep, not 6 inches deep. And so quite a few of them came home to do nothing more than put their equipment and their families into a wagon and head off for Ohio or Missouri or the upper Midwest or any place where farming seemed a little less like an act of desperation or insanity. This was the beginning of what has now been called the Great Out-Migration, but it was far from the only reason why the farmers of New England moved away from stone wall building. The Industrial Revolution had a great deal to do with it as well, which first of all created all kinds of factory jobs in places like Lowell, Massachusetts, and Lawrence, and Manchester, New Hampshire, and on every little river in a great many parts of New England. These shops began to draw young people off the farms and thus reduced the labor force that was available for agricultural work. The invention of barbed wire in 1868 came just a little bit before this federal report on fencing, but it also coincided with the switchover in livestock emphasis in many places from sheep to dairy. And this was, of course, precipitated in part by the railroads, which began to come through the countryside and really changed what farmers could hope to ship in terms of perishable produce or stock from one part of the country to another. This also created an enormous shift. The death of the sheep industry, however, was probably a decisive factor as well here, because once our dependency on sheep for economic reasons began to fade, began to be co-opted by competition from places as far away as Montana, an enormous number of sheep farms in higher elevation began swiftly to go out of business. But perhaps the most profound effect the Industrial Revolution had on the building of dry-laid stone walls was its mechanization of agriculture. And this bears talking about for just a minute or two. You know, the model that was brought here by European farmers at the beginning of the 17th century was a model that held that small fields produced best. And so what we tend to see when European farmers begin to move into these areas and break them out for land to be used as pasture, as mowing, as growing space, is that they tend to break the acreage up, at least at first, in the so-called rough and ready days of settlement, into small pieces, 2 to 3 to 5 acres. This was because all work was done by hand. Now imagine if you were, for instance, mowing hay and a tiny little 3-acre piece is nicely bound in by old stone walls. Well, if you're mowing with a scythe, you can step right up the edge of those walls, can't you? Cut every blade of grass into place. But by the end of the 19th century, a lot of farmers weren't cutting hay that way anymore. Instead, they were dragging a 6 or an 8-foot cutter bar behind a team of horses or oxen. When you're dragging a machine behind a team, you have to start turning about 20 feet before every corner in order to get the machine and the team around. That meant that in every single one of these little medieval-style fields, there were now 4 useless triangles of land. Well, useless triangles of land are not especially popular among frugal New England farmers, and so not a few of them found themselves toward the end of the century digging large trenches beside old stone walls that in many cases had been built by their own fathers or grandfathers, or even on occasion by themselves, dumping the walls into them and burying them just below the surface of the ground in order to enlarge their fields and make them more economically responsive to the new machine agriculture. Well, New England, as a result of this enormous shift and all the farming that it lost during the course of that shift, began to become a kind of backwater, if you will. We had a fair period of prosperity that I'll talk a little bit more about in a second, but it certainly came to a screeching halt. This does not mean that farming suffered and died altogether, only that an enormous amount, especially of higher elevation land, ended up being abandoned during this period. I've read that the state of Vermont lost something in the neighborhood of a quarter of its farms in the last 25 or 30 years of the 19th century, moving on into the 20th, almost all of them at higher elevations, because those lands had been dedicated to the sheep industry, which had now fled. And so an enormous number of farmers simply walked away from their land and left it as is. Coupled with the uptick in dairy, the appearance of barbed wire, and so on, this meant that the motivation for building or even maintaining existing stone walls disappeared. Not quite overnight, but historically speaking, in a very short amount of time. But how did we get all these walls in the first place? You know, it might seem counterintuitive, but one of the reasons for that, so much wall being built in such a short period of time, was that the first choice of farmers, as far as fencing goes, as they began to develop places like Vermont and my own state of New Hampshire, their first choice of fencing wasn't stone. It was the great mess you get when you have to cut down thousands of acres of virgin forest. And so the earliest fences that we see, far from being made of stone, were built of pulled stumps, just yanked out of the ground and set up in great long forbidding rows, or split rails like the kind that Abe Lincoln later made. At the same time, however, they were building these rather primitive types of fencing to sustain their animals and themselves, of course, at the same time that they were developing the land itself. They also discovered what all of you know quite well, which is that we live in a remarkably stony part of the country. And so they also found themselves, in addition to creating the arable spaces that they needed, obligated to move enormous amounts of surface stone off the land in order to plow or plant, or in some cases simply to walk around. This they did by hauling the stone out to the edges of the fields they were creating and throwing it up against the organic fencing, the stumps, the split rails, and so forth. Well, as their clearing became more and more complete, and they began to produce a landscape that resembles parts of England with its enormous amounts of open space, interrupted here and there by copses of trees, little villages, and so forth. they found that it was a relatively easy choice to make, to simply begin to reorganize those long, low, rounded mounds of stone they had already collected. The fact that so much of that supply in the initial burst of stone wall building was already laid out along the fence lines where the walls themselves are going to go, vastly speeded up the process of creating them. Just to give you some perspective on this, the entire nation of Great Britain, where they have been building dry-laid stonework for well over 10,000 years, has in it only about 70,000 miles of stone walls in the whole country. We built more than 3 times that amount in a fraction of the historical time. It's been estimated by one naturalist that the bulk of our stone walls, on a volume basis anyway, was created in a mere 50-year period between about 1775 and 1825. In other words, from the end of the Revolution on into the early decades of the 19th century. If you extend that out by 25 years on either side, you have an even century that runs from 1750 to 1850, during which the vast majority of our agricultural, older, rougher stone walls was constructed. It makes sense that this kind of burst of energy would take place in the immediate aftermath of the Revolution, when we were no longer obligated to fight a war on our own soil. However, an event occurred at the beginning of the 19th century that vastly accelerated the building of stone walls here. That was the arrival of the first merino sheep in our part of the world. When we finally pried these sheep loose from Spain and Portugal, they instantly became the primary, the go-to animal, if you will, for an enormous number of New England farms. They made a lot of farmers really successful, and they accounted for the only sustained period of agricultural prosperity our region has really ever known. The sheep industry bloomed with enormous enthusiasm beginning at around 1811, and it sustained itself pretty well up until about 1838 or 1840 or so, when the usual devils of agricultural uncertainty, things like bank failures, tariff problems, and so forth, began to wear on it. And then it got a little bit of a bump in the run-up to the Civil War because of the need for uniforms, but after that it really crashed rather badly. My own state of New Hampshire lost hundreds of thousands of farms. Let's just give you another bit of perspective here. In 1837, which we would think of as very near the peak of the sheep industry's success story, there were about 300,000 people living in the state of Vermont. They were keeping these 300,000 hardy farmers more than 1.6 million sheep in this state. 300,000 people, 1.6 million sheep. This was an astonishing development, especially for farmers in higher elevation areas, but it also obligated them to enclose thousands of acres in addition to what they had already cleared and fenced in. And this is when we begin to see the craft professionalize itself a little bit, with gangs of men moving around the countryside, making deals with farmers to put up such and such an amount of wall for such and such a price. This situation persisted advantageously, I guess you could say, for perhaps 30 years, 35 years before it began to fade away. And when it did, farmers abandoned huge amounts of land, which immediately began to return to forest. Well, who was it actually who built these walls? One of the reasons that people are so astonished when they understand exactly how much work got done by these small families tend to think of our old farming families in nuclear terms, you know, mom, dad, some strapping sons, a few daughters, and so on. But households were somewhat larger than that in these days. They included indentured servants, sometimes paid, sometimes not. Households tended to exchange teenagers for education purposes in the days before public education really took hold. And so the labor forces on a lot of these farms were somewhat larger than what we would expect to see if it was only a nuclear type of family. Also, farmers tended to swap labor on large projects too, whether it was framing a barn or putting up a certain amount of stone wall. And so as the century progressed and stone wall building became something that was appeared to be about to fade away in the aftermath of the outmigration of farmers and the loss of certain farm industries such as the sheep for particular sectors of the countryside, it appeared that stone wall building was going to fade away a little bit. But in the middle of the 19th century, we began to experience the arrival of a considerable number of equally skilled stone wall builders who came into the country from other parts of Europe where stone wall building was a recognized profession. Now I'm talking about countries such as Greece, certainly Ireland, Italy, and so forth. And they found work. It just wasn't for the farmers. They went to work for the railroads, putting up enormous amounts of infrastructure in the form of culvert headers, bridge abutments, that sort of thing. They went to work for municipalities, building walls around public reservoirs and cemeteries, other places. And they went to work for the wealthy, who in some cases were beginning to buy up some of the old farms in places like Jaffrey or Dublin, Wolfboro, certainly plenty of places in Vermont as well, and then convert them into summer estates. This immigrant building began a kind of shift in terms of the emphasis with which stone walls were built and what their purposes were. Essentially, the shift was one from away from agricultural considerations that had something to do with livestock or with protecting certain parts of the land from that livestock or confining them, and much more to do with symbolism, with decoration, with landscaping. This is the most profound general shift that has occurred in stone wall building. In other words, the sheep industry may have produced all those thousands of miles of stone walls out in the hinterlands that run up and down hills that are too steep to stand on, or appear in the middle of a swamp, that leave you scratching your head about why such a structure would be built in such a place and for what purpose, and substitute instead a much tighter, flatter version of these walls that was used primarily for decorative or for landscaping purposes. This is the situation that took us over the top into the 20th century, in which stone wall building, which had now become a well-recognized symbol not only of New England, but of a certain kind of historical approach to farming. This reputation, if you will, that the region had was very much behind the switch to a more decorative approach. Stone walls became a kind of marker in their own day, even as early as the early decades of the 19th century, that spoke to passers-by about the relative qualities of citizenship and good farming of the farmer in charge of any particular place. Even the curmudgeonly dictionary writer Noah Webster observed one time that sloppy or ill-built stone walls on a New England farm were a sign of laziness or sloth on the part of the farmer, or both. And so this the shift, if you will, of emphasis from a practical standpoint to a more decorative one began fairly early, but really took hold into the 20th century. The immigrant stone wall builders were very much a part of that transition because they built by selecting individual stones to give a certain project a kind of consistency of look. This was the opposite approach of the farmers who had preceded them, who tried to use everything that they could. Everything that came to hand to put into the walls that they were building. Since their purpose was primarily practical and not aesthetic, they also had an ancillary goal, of course, that the immigrant builders later on, the ones focused on decorative type work, did not have, which was that they needed to use up as much of the stone that came to hand as they possibly could. This is a phenomenon that's rather different if you look at stone wall building on a kind of worldwide basis. Most people throughout the world, when they set out to build a stone wall, if they live in a part of the world where there's plenty of material to do so, build things because they want a wall. We did that too. But we also did it because we needed to get rid of stone walls, as much stone as we possibly could, even with those efforts. This is responsible, of course, for the fact that a great many of the older traditional New England stone walls are built considerably heavier than what we see in other parts of the world, specifically England. They're thicker, they're taller, they use more material in order to hold themselves together. Part of that is a climate demand. It was colder here, of course, then than it typically was in England, and so the footprints of stone walls needed to be a little bit wider and thicker in order to resist any destruction by frost as time went on. Well, there's all kinds of things to say about that shift in style, but let's talk just for a moment about how these walls are put together. There is, for you Star Trek fans, a prime directive in stone wall building. It is this. If you're going to put a dry laid stone structure together and you would like it to stay together for as long as possible, because contrary to the mythology of New England stone walls, every single one of them falls down sooner or later. And so your objective when you're building one is to build something that's going to fall down later, not sooner. You do this by following the prime directive, which in one iteration is to lay one stone over two, or two over one. This is a shorthand way of saying that one of the principal structural practices you need to observe is the idea of shifting courses, that is to say rows of stone in any given structure, so that the stones of the upper structure are straddling the cracks between the stones of the course below them. This redistributes weight and pressure across the entire structure, and it avoids one of the worst mistakes you can make in stone wall building, which is to stack individual stones on top of each other like this. Oddly enough, this is called stack bonding. And the reason that it is bad is because it separates the entire structure into segregated sections that can then come apart much more easily over time. Well, why does this matter? These are stones. They don't have legs. They're not trying to get away. Or are they? The fact is that every stone in the world has an ambition: to sink to the center of the earth as soon as possible. It's extraordinarily patient about waiting for an opportunity to fulfill this ambition, and when it gets one, it accepts immediately. You know, we do have earthquakes around here from time to time. They're not very spectacular by California standards, but they're enough. Over my way, about 15 years ago, we had one of the heaviest ones we've had in New England for quite some time. It was a massive 4.0. Under the town of Sanford, Maine, right near the border of New Hampshire. Some of you may remember this. You know, most of our earthquakes, they're like 1.9 or 2.3, right? You don't even feel them when they happen. You just read about them in the paper the next day. This was not like that. My house is in Hopkinton, New Hampshire. It's 65 miles from Sanford, Maine. The morning that earthquake hit, it shook like a leaf for about a second and a half, and I heard the big boom. More to the point, every stone and every wall between me and Sanford, Maine, and in a whole lot of other places too, said to itself, "Hey, here's my chance. I can get a little closer to the center of the earth." And if there was any space around that stone, available space in the structure that it occupied, it would slip or slide or otherwise contrive to get itself into that piece of space and thus get a little closer to the center of the earth. This is why stone walls are like people. They loosen up and spread out as they get older. And then fall apart completely eventually. Now they do this very slowly. We fall apart lots faster than stone walls do, but it happens nonetheless. And so the building of stone walls is actually an exercise in holding back the ravages of time. The 1/2, 2/1 rule is functional as far as it goes, but it does tend to imply that all the stones that you're going to be dealing with are the same thickness, right? This is a laughable assertion in New England. All the stones in New England are not of the same thickness. And so, in many cases, if you have an average run of average glacially worn fieldstone in front of you, you're going to have a tough time matching up a bunch of stones that are exactly the same thickness. So 1/2, 2/1 implies that that is the case. It's probably more productive to think instead of joints and seams. The idea of cross-hatching parts of the layers of a stone in a wall in order to give each one multiple physical dependencies for holding its position means that you want to make sure that you can't see running joints going straight up or going straight in any direction in which the cracks between multiple layers of stones are lined up as though they were a single crack. That is a structurally damaging thing to do to stone walls. You know, it's not only earthquakes that are trying to take them apart from the moment they're first put together. Other culprits include the expansion of tree roots underneath them, the catastrophic events like falls or hurricanes, the tunneling of animals, the general sinking of walls into the ground as time goes on, in which there's uneven compression from one side of the one section of the wall to another that opens up vertical splits. All of these things and others as well conspire to start taking stone walls apart and spreading them out over the landscape as they age, as they get older. But if a stone wall is tightly put together with very little available space on its interior for stones to move around, no matter what it is that's trying to move them around, they tend to develop a kind of structural flexibility. Perhaps you've seen, for instance, a nice old stone wall running alongside an old cemetery somewhere, where someone thought to plant a row of pines or maples right beside that stone wall at the time it was built. Well, as those trees mature and their root systems begin to expand underneath the wall itself, they tend to thrust up the little section that's most near to them. And you can see if the wall happens to be well built after, a bunch of decades or a couple hundred years, that the wall itself begins to develop a kind of a bubble. And that means it's properly built together, put together, because when the individual stones within a wall all have several to depend on in order to hold something like their position, you can actually thrust upward underneath them, whether you are a root or a frost heave. And then when that, for instance, in the case of a frost heave, when the thaw comes in the spring, the wall tends to collapse right back into the configuration that it had before. This is true only if the entire wall is settled together in a way that leaves no space among stones for individuals that have been moved one way or another to not resume their original position. So you're really trying to play a game with the ravages of time when you put them together. Usually if a wall is going to develop problems, it develops them because you haven't paid enough attention to this. It tends to develop them fairly quickly, within 10 to 20 years. And if that happens that soon, then you know there's some sort of structural difficulty with the way the walls were put together in the first place. Our forebears, as I said, had found that building stone walls in New England is a little different from building them in other parts of the world, not just because of the necessity to use up as much stone as possible, but also because, you know, in most parts of the world where they build a lot of stone walls, the available stone supply is relatively homogeneous with respect to its array of shapes and sizes. If you look at pictures, for instance, of the sheep walls on the Aran Islands off the coast of Ireland or other places in England, or even parts of some parts of this country, such as the Kentucky, Virginia, Tennessee triangle, which is a great hotbed of wonderful dry-laid stone wall building. You'll see that most of the stones that are being presented in the wall are relatively the same size and shape. It's quite different from what we see in New England, where we have nothing but a giant mess of every kind of shape and size, from a ping pong ball to a Volkswagen bus. And so this is yet another reason why overbuilding turned out to be a useful technique for New England builders. But even with all that overbuilding, they were still unable to properly dispose of all the stone that they had to get out of their own way. And that is why New England is absolutely covered, not just with the walls that they managed to build or other structures, but also with what we call stone dumps. These are enormous mounds of waste stone that never found their way into any structure but had to be moved away from where they were first gathered. And they are almost everywhere. The difficulty with identifying them has to do with how old some of them are. If you go wandering out in the woods, you may stop to have a drink of water on a little promontory, some little high spot that you find out there, and be completely unaware that you're standing on a mound that contains 300 tons of waste stone that were dumped at some point there in the middle of the 19th century by a farmer who had nothing more that he could do with them except get rid of them in a place where they weren't going to be in his way anymore. Well, the stone wall building, having turned itself into a decorative art rather than a practical one at the beginning of the 20th century, began to ally itself with other aesthetic movements that touched us here in New England. One of them was the arts and crafts movement, which resulted in the creation of the so-called shingle style of architecture. This was the arts and crafts movement was an aesthetic movement that was essentially anti-industrialist, that wanted to reconsider the value of natural materials. And so New England stones by then were such a common building material for many things that they fell naturally into this category. If you've ever seen a nice little cottage, for instance, it was built in perhaps 1923 or 1918, and the knee walls and the pillars, the posts out in front that hold up the roof of the porch in front of the building are all made of tiny little river stones, all cemented together. You see this, and people built also portal pillars at the bottoms of their driveways this way. You're looking at a kind of contribution that was made by the tradition itself of New England stone wall building to changes in the way home architecture was conceived, designed, and executed here in this part of the country. They also benefited from the colonial revival of the latter part of the 19th century, in which we decided it would be a good idea to spiff up some of our old town commons or to rebuild some of the old pounds. This impulse persisted into the Great Depression as well, in which you can see the results of this in some certain plaques that are sometimes installed on a rebuilt town pound that may have been rehabilitated by, say, the Civic Club in a certain town during the course of 1933 or 1942, that sort of thing. It appeared, however, even with these efforts, when we got past the Depression and World War II, that stone wall building was going to simply disappear as a traditional craft here. But in the mid to late 70s, we entered the current era of residential housing construction. This created an enormous demand for landscape services that had not been there before. And it is responsible for an enormous revival of stone wall building that began in the late, in the late 70s and is persisting to this day. There are probably more people right now learning and practicing this trade than have been active in it for at least the last century, if not the last century plus. So we are in no danger of losing this craft, even though it has altered itself and its purposes significantly over time. Well, that is my endless spiel, and now I come to the part where I ask you, please help me out here. Tell me what it is you'd really like to know. Yes, sir.
If I imagine that to be a scale model, let's say it's 1/20 scale, how long would it take you to actually, one person, build that around the corner of that piece of the front?
Well, you can see that this is built for 4-inch sheep. I don't have any more of those, but if I had some, it would keep them well. What kind of a scale are you talking about?
If that's 2 foot, say, let's say that's a 20-foot wall, something like that?
Yeah. How long would it take me to do it? Some people are able to, who do this, are able to make one-size-fits-all estimates. I've never been able to do that. There are too many variables. One is, what am I building on? Is this a place where a wall has stood before, where the ground is already compressed? Is this a place where the ground itself, the underlying ground, is what us old-timers call bony, in other words, full of stones? Is it clay? Is it sand? What is it? That will tell me whether or not I need to do something elaborate underneath it to give it a more solid base. The old-timers, by the way, tended to build flat to the ground. They very rarely dug trenches under their walls. And so my orientation being toward that older style of work, I would seek not to do so, but in a place where the fill is fresh or is wet or it's sandy, it's probably a good idea to say dig an 18-inch trench or so and fill it up with crushed riprap or bank run gravel, something like that. So there's the site prep is one issue. The next one is, where's the stone coming from? Is it right there? Am I working on a place where there's old broken down walls on the back land of a certain property and I can go and plunder them? Or do I have to bring the stone? That would have an enormous effect on the cost too. Generally speaking, the next question is, what kind of a wall am I going to build? And you've given me a nice segue here. The incredible variety of New England stone means that many, many walls throughout New England look very different from each other and lead people to think that there are lots of different styles, structurally speaking. The fact is, there's only 2 kinds of walls, if you're only talking about structure. They are the freestanding wall, which rises into space and shows what we call faces, the outside surfaces on both sides, and the retaining wall is the other one, which shows a face on only one side and marks the difference between 2 grades of different height. The principal difference between these 2 types of walls in structural terms is the mathematical relationship of width to height. Stone walls must have a certain amount of mass in order to hold themselves together over time. If they are too thin for the height they are trying to reach, they will come apart much sooner because there simply isn't enough pressure being exerted by upper courses on the lower ones to hold them in place, even if they're tightly put together. So what type of wall it is and how tall it's going to be are enormous factors in cost too. You notice I haven't given you a number yet. I don't know what it is. It could be anything from $100 a foot to several hundred over time, depending on what it is and what the solution to its various peculiarities is going to be. For the formula, if you will, is not stated anywhere that I have seen, but my family and I have taken apart enough older work now to see something operating that is definable. And that is that the general formula for freestanding walls appears to be a relationship of 3/4 to 1. By that I mean a wall that has a certain height needs to have a footprint. In other words, the part of the wall is touching the ground, how thick it is, how wide it is, of at least 3/4 of that height, or it won't hold itself together very well over time. So that means if you're going to try to build a 6-foot tall freestanding wall, you need to start with at least a 4-foot wide footprint, so that it will be able to reach that height without tumbling down or falling apart within a few short years. That way you can crosshatch things enough and nail, if you will, with longer so-called through stones, one side of it to the other, so that sections of it won't simply peel off and fall away, because you've got a seam running down the middle of the wall between the outside stones that show and the interior packing that you've put in between that one and the stones that show on the other side. For retaining walls, the formula is even stricter. It begins at 1 to 1 and goes up from there. Retaining walls are used for many, many purposes, but one of the principal ones here in New England is as foundations under houses and barns. In this, they are among the masterpieces of New England stone wall building. We often see some of the most careful work in foundations that we observe among the older rough style farmer work. And this is because it's pretty obvious. It's a whole lot more difficult to do any repair work on a stone wall when there's a 40 by 60 barn sitting on it than it is any kind of stone wall that's exposed out in the open. And so we often see much more careful work in foundations than we see in other kinds of buildings. The other thing we discovered about these older walls is older retaining walls is how much stone they can be made to consume. My family and I took apart an old wall, a foundation wall that was under a 2-story carriage house one time. It had 8-foot tall walls in its cellar. Behind them, we found more than 12 feet of carefully laid stone running in from the showing face in the inside of the cellar. This is 1 to 1.5, more than 4 times the bulk you would have needed to make a similar freestanding wall stand up. The backside of this wall was built in an absolutely classic New England way. It did not run straight up, but was rather bent over into a rough hypotenuse, so that 12-foot footprint stepped roughly up, narrowing all the way until it got to about an 18-inch cap, which is where the sill of the building sat. This created an enormous reverse dam, if you will, that is perfectly capable of holding back the settling fill of the high side, which is why badly built retaining walls tend to tip over away from their banks as time goes by. If you've ever seen a retaining wall that is doing this, you're seeing one in which that backside triangle, if you will, was not built heavily enough to prevent the settling fill on the upper side from pushing the structure over as time went by. Oh yes, right here.
So for a, what do you call it, I think a foundation wall for an old barn,
Yeah.
how would they, like, they're massive. Like, how do they place those?
It's pretty amazing, isn't it? Yeah.
I mean, and this one's like still true, and the stones that they use in it are just so massive. And
Yeah.
so I assume it's oxen or like rollers?
Yes,
or
yeah, oxen and later horses too. Horses are more nervous, oxen are a little calmer for this kind of stuff. This is a question about moving really heavy weights, and in other words, about moving stones from one place to another. Even if you could get 50 workers to get their hands on it, they still wouldn't be able to lift it off the ground. First thing you have to remember is that when you see those great big stones that are 4, 5, 6 feet off the ground, is to remind yourself they have never left the ground.
Okay.
They never were taken off the ground as they were brought to this, whatever position they're in. When I first started working at this in the early 1970s, I was taught by my uncle, who was a mason, no, he was a farmer, not a mason. he was very fond of saying to me, if you can move it an inch, you can move it a mile. So it's not what a 22-year-old kid wants to hear. If you can move it an inch, you can move it a mile. But he left out a very important part, which is that you have to be willing to move it a mile, an inch at a time. Now suppose this was 10 feet long and 18 inches wide and 2 feet wide and 18 inches thick. I could personally take it home to my house in Hopkinton, New Hampshire, using one other small stone and the magic wand of stone wall building, which is the 6-foot iron bar. All you have to do is get one end of it off the ground. So you bring your stone to the end. These bars generate incredible pressure at their tips. If you know how to use them with a fulcrum, all you have to do is get it 6 inches off the ground. Then I get my my helper, to bring me a little piece of round sapling, about 4 feet long, that we have prepared against this eventuality, and I drop the end of the stone down onto that sapling, and I do the same thing at the other end. Now it's on rollers. And all I have to do is attach a rope or a chain that's tied up to my team, and off we go. And as it passes over each roller in turn, we bring it forward. We bring the one that's been passed forward and put it under this end. This way you can move it over space. If it doesn't happen to have a flat surface to it, which allows this technique to be used, we can use what's called a stone boat, which is really nothing but a sled, 3 planks with a prow on it, that does exactly the same thing, except that it just simply slides along the surface of the ground. Much of the movement of heavy weights, whether it was about individual stones or even logs, was done in the winter in the old days when the tracks would freeze and either the sleds or the stones themselves could be dragged along icy roads. It was discovered recently, for instance, that the workers who created the enormous 50-ton block walls of the Forbidden City in Beijing quarried their stones and then dragged them along special roads built of ice in the winter in order to get them from the quarry to the building site. And this kind of technique, no doubt, was also in use in places like Stonehenge and others, where spectacular, enormous stones were moved from one place to another. Once brought to a project, a great big stone could be placed anywhere that you wanted. A number of different ways. In the case of the barn foundation you're talking about, it is most likely that that stone was never lifted off the purported cellar floor of the barn into place, but rather that it was dragged to the high side, where the bank itself was already higher than the wall, and therefore 2 or 3 guys with those magic wands, those 6-foot iron bars, could roll or flip it down into place from above. If that wasn't possible, they frequently would build temporary ramps at any point in the project where a stone could be rolled or flipped up. They discovered very early on that a stone that is sitting on another stone is far easier to move, for instance, than one that is sitting on the dirt. This is because the contact points are so few, and because they're solid, they don't give at all, and therefore there's no drag. With using a temporary ramp, what you would do is drag or roll your very large stone to the bottom of the ramp, and then you would move the team. You disengage the team and bring it around to the other side of the project. Throw the traces over the wall itself and tie what's called a rolling hitch to the stone in question. Rolling is your way of attaching a rope or chain to a stone so that the knot that holds the chain itself together around the object is at the back side of the object that you're going to move. Therefore, when the team pulls on it from the other side, instead of dragging up the ramp, it flips over. Doing this, you can get it up onto the wall. Yet another technique was to leave one end of the wall let it graduate down to to the ground itself, so that the wall itself is a kind of temporary ramp, and then the larger stones brought to the end of it can be flipped over and rolled along the structure until they're at the place that you want. All these things take an enormous amount of time, and that's really the difference.
When you were talking about team doing a hitch and flipping it over, they had guys down in the trips ready to hit it, right? So it wouldn't roll back.
Yes.
They had to do that.
Sure, yeah, you'd have them spotting it, so to speak.
Yes.
Right, so it couldn't do that. But if the team keeps pressure on the rope, they can get the tips of their bars under it in order to reset, if you will, so that it won't do that. That's right. Now, some of these, this one, for instance, is pretty flat. If you flipped it over, not likely to roll back down your ramp because it can't roll. So that would be a
Volkswagen size stone.
Yeah, that's right.
They got a minus.
That's right. You know, the people who did this sort of thing were not like us. They really weren't.
No.
They were production oriented. I'm sorry, they were task oriented. We're production oriented. If we can't get a thing done within the time frame or within the means that we think it ought to be done with, we either convince ourselves we didn't really want it in the first place, or we call somebody else who's got a bigger hammer than we do, right? These folks did not have those luxuries. They had to take the time to do what needed to be done. They were task-oriented entirely. This is all the more amazing because, you know, when they began this process way back in 1620, the average life expectancy was about 46. How they managed to do this, within about 8 generations, they completely transformed New England into something that was a deep virgin forest over most of its land surface, to a patchwork of villages and farms, and even growing towns, really within the course of about 8 generations of people. People who study this for a living still can't figure out how they managed this. And this isn't just about the thousands of miles of stone walls they built either. This is about the buildings, the churches, the rearrangement of the landscape in wholesale terms. And then it all fell apart at the end of the 19th century and began to grow back to forest again. You know, just one effect of this, we see so many old stone walls out in the countryside, and they're maybe 2 or 3 feet high, right? And we go, well, what's that going to keep in? Well, nothing. The standard height for a livestock-bearing stone wall in the days when these things mattered was 4.5 to 5 feet. They were much, much taller than what we see in most of the countryside. Now, there are parts of New England where they're still there at their original heights. The coast of Rhode Island is one such place. If you drive down to towns like Tiverton or Little Compton, you'll see absolutely beautiful old double-faced stone walls. They were used for sheep and other animals that run to 6 feet high. Now, out in the woods, 2 things are occurring with a stone wall that is that's been left along with the abandoned and now reforesting land. One, of course, is that the ordinary ravages of time topple stones off the top. One of the kinds of walls that was built during the sheep craze, for instance, was a particular subversion of the freestanding wall, which we today call the farmer wall or the single stack. And this raises a question. The single stack wall is only 1 stone thick, right? You've seen these, they're everywhere. 1 stone thick, they're very delicate. It's easy to push them down. And it's easier for natural forces to destroy them. Now, why, in a place where one of your ancillary objectives in building any stone structure was to use up as much stone as you could possibly lay your hands on, would you ever build a style that uses the least amount of stone possible in order to create barrier? The answer is speed. These walls are far faster to build than anything double-faced or very thick. And although they are delicate, You can put, a small crew with ready access to stone can put up dozens of feet of this type in a day. This is one of the reasons we got so much stone wall so fast, and it's another reason why we got so much stone wall done so fast in such a tiny amount of time after the sheep industry began. They just threw these things up all over the place, and they require regular maintenance. Some of you might be familiar with Frost's famous poem, Mending Wall, in which he and his neighbor walk up and down along the side of a wall that separates their properties in East Derry, New Hampshire, where Frost lived in 1915 when his poem was written. This chore that they do with each other is an annual affair. It's not a special event. These walls needed regular maintenance, and they got it as long as the sheep were still a factor. But if you've ever seen an old stone wall with strands of barbed wire, rusty barbed wire running along it, and we all have, you're looking at a wall in which you can be reasonably certain that on the day that wire was installed, and it could not have been before the early 1870s, because it wasn't invented until the end of the 1860s, you can be pretty sure that any maintenance that wall was receiving came to an abrupt end the minute that wire was put in place. So it at least gives you some basic idea of when the deterioration began. Now, out in a reforested place, not only is the regular toppling of stones off the top of a wall done by any number of things a feature, but our old stone walls are also losing enormous amounts of height from the bottom. In a place where the forest came back 150 years ago, you've got 150 annual leaf falls and all the other junk that comes blowing off the trees, to say nothing of the trees themselves that are occasionally blown down in large numbers, as in the Hurricane of '38 or other events. This constant accumulation of junk tends to blow itself up against the old walls out in the woods because they act like snow fences. So you can often see, walking through one of these spots where there's old walls, but it's been reforested for a long time, you'll see the ground level come along relatively evenly and then rise slightly, starting about 4 feet away from those old walls. What's in the little mounds that are accumulating along the sides of them is not only a lot of the stone that has toppled off the top over time, but also all that leaf mold, sticks, pods, seeds, all that junk that's fetched up against the wall and then rotted down. You scrape away some of the turf from that wall, you will very often see 2 or even 3 courses of stone. And it's very easy to obviously think to yourself, oh, well, the farmer dug a trench under this wall and buried it. But overwhelmingly, the old-timers built flat to the ground, so that wasn't it. What has happened is that the forest floor has risen against it. And in many places, this is to the tune of 1.5 feet, 2 feet of new soil right up against it. If you lose a foot from the top and 2 feet from the bottom, you can see how a 5-foot wall becomes a 3-foot wall pretty quick, right? This is what has happened to enormous numbers of walls that aren't right beside the roads. Now, in the early part of the 20th century as well, when there were far fewer people scattered around the countryside than there had been before, it was a tradition. I know this because it was still in force when I first began to build, of people who needed stone simply helping themselves to whatever was alongside the road. It was not frowned on. It was not thought of as stealing. It was what you did. In most of the old farm places where these roadside walls were vulnerable to that kind of pilfering, no one had lived on the farm for a really long time. So the conclusion was that the stones were free for all. I'm glad to say that this attitude has come under some attack in the last few decades, because it's not nice to steal things that belong to other people. But we've also found, as a consequence of the new interest in stone walls that has sprung up, not only among people who are causing them to be built or building them, in preserving some of what's left from the past. And so in addition to the fact that the craft is still being pursued pretty actively by a fairly large number of people. There's also a greater consciousness among the public of the historical value of some of the older stonework that is still in pretty decent shape. Now, I'm not talking here about the ones that have old stone walls that have flattened themselves out completely, now bear no resemblance whatsoever to what they looked like when they were first built. I don't tend to regard this wreckage as historically particularly significant. And in fact, a person like me, who's in the business of building things, knows that there's only one place that you can get nice old weathered stone if what your objective is to restore something that was already old when you started, or creating something new that is meant to look old. And that is out of old walls themselves. Stones dug directly from the ground don't look anything like the ones that have been exposed to the weather for 200 years. And that's the only way to get them to look like that. So what we have here is a lot of antique structures built out of extremely valuable building material to some people. And that creates a kind of tension between people who are looking for supplies to do what they want to do and those who would like to preserve older walls. Yes?
No stone walls before Europeans got here? But it's a question.
Yeah, I don't mean to say that or imply it. No, Native Americans did build things in stone, but they didn't build what we would now think of as fences. They built totemic structures in their villages, sometimes meant to convey a message of one kind or another. They built practical structures for temporary food storage on a seasonal basis, triangular or circular little huts out of stone where they would store something dried or something that was preserved, smoked meat perhaps, something like that. When they went to another part of their range, say to hunt or fish in a certain time of the year, and they knew they were going to return to the area. Because of this and other things they built, they were regarded, even though they themselves did not run animals and so had no need for fencing, nevertheless, they were adept at using natural materials, especially stone. And so Native Americans are responsible for a large amount of our old stonework, most of it down on the coasts. In the aftermath of King Philip's War and the other little wars that were associated with it at the end of the 17th century, many Native Americans were enslaved. Some of them were shipped off to the Caribbean. Others were put to work in one way or another, and one of those ways was in building stone walls. They also worked, some of them, for pay. Doing that, and they are responsible for quite a few of the walls down in Little Compton, for instance, and in other parts of New England. They simply didn't build walls for themselves, but they were known as exceptionally skillful wall builders. What else can I tell you? Yes, right here.
This was really interesting. Thank you very much for all of the stories and for building a wall right in front of our eyes. And so my question is, that was pretty impressive multitasking, because you kept that pattern. And so what I wanted to know was, do you, after all this time, have a process that you utilize when you're putting together even a wall like this? Small stones, different sizes. I mean, is there anything for us novices that you can tell us about what you do?
An awful lot of this is, it's not just about finding a solid landing spot for each individual stone so that it does not rock or move, so that it is not trying to topple forward out of the wall. One thing that takes some time to learn is the notion of anticipating what is yet to come. Because with every stone that you put in, you not only have to think about how secure the position it is in at the time you put it there, but you also have to consider what it is that's going to come along later. One of the mistakes that many people make is, for instance, when they're building, they find a really great spot for a particular stone, and they lay it in there, but they neglect to see. Can you see how the end of this is much fatter than this is kind of a pointy end? They might think that the straight line right here looks really good out front, and so they'll find a place to put it. But what they've done is they've put this kind of ski jump into a place where they actually have to put another stone later, right? It's not going to sit on this, no matter how solid it is in the place where it sits. So it is not just about how carefully you place the stone itself. It's also about what it has to offer to come. Another thing that bedevils many people when they first begin to teach themselves this is working backwards. And that means this, you know, when you're building a stone wall, you got a big bunch of stone just kind of slopped out on the ground in front of you, right? And then you've got the project itself, in which you have to find a way to fill whatever theoretical space you're talking about that's defined by the height and width and so forth of the thing you're trying to make. In other words, you're trying to fill an invisible suitcase perfectly, something like that. People tend to become aware of useful stones right away. A typical useful stone is almost like a loaf of bread. It's got defined ends and sides, and it's got a little bit more length than it has width, so that you can lay that stone so that its length runs back in to be gripped by the mass on the other side, and is not too shallow. In other words, the whole stone isn't too far, its weight is not too far out near the showing surface of the stone. That way it's not only going to be gripped by what it's sitting on, but it's going to be gripped in the back by other stones that are packed around it within the middle of the wall. So you're really trying to break any seams that may exist between the showing faces, the interior, and the other face, so that you're not really building separate structures. In the course of this, people become pretty sensitive pretty quickly to what constitutes a buildable nice stone. And then they go looking for those in their pile, right? Because they're easier to lay and they do a better job. And they'll find one that they think is really great, and they'll pick it up and they'll start looking for a place to put it. Now remember, I'm telling you about working backwards here. And they start walking. And they walk and they try a place, and that's no good. And they walk some more, and they try a place, and that's no good. No, okay. And they walk, you get this, right? They're walking around the wall looking for a place that may or may not exist. And they're still holding the stone. This is the way to have to go to the hospital before lunch. Right? It's working backwards. What you want to do is look at the wall. Look at what you're making, not what you're making it out of. You can teach yourself, and this is also one of those things that takes a little time, to memorize 2 or 3 spots where a stone of a particular shape will be helpful. And then, instead of just going to your pile to look for the next pretty face, you're going to the pile to look for something really specific that's going to go into a certain place. If you have 2 or 3 spaces in mind, you are much more likely to find something that's going to fit them. And then, and here's the important part, the transaction of picking it up, taking it to the wall, and placing it is a one-time thing. You don't handle that stone any more than you have to. This matters a great deal in terms of your stamina and ability to stay with the job. Stone wall building is not a fast, strenuous thing. It is not like throwing bales of hay into the mow. It's a thing in which you spend considerable amounts of time standing, staring, and then a small flurry of action, and then more standing and staring. You can get much better at this, but if you're working backwards, you exhaust yourself And the other negative thing about that is that you use up all your best stuff immediately, and then you have to spend the rest of the day working with basketballs or cloven cannonballs or any of the other terrible shapes that don't like to play nice with others. So just those little habits of technique. Everyone develops them slightly differently over the course of time, but I often say about stone wall building that it's a thing you can learn the rules of in a day, but applying them takes a little longer than that, especially when you're dealing with the kind of stone that we have here. I saw a hand over here. Are you still there? Yep.
When you go out in the woods and find a wall that you've never seen before,
Yep.
what clues do you look for to figure out roughly how old it is? Is this a 16th century wall? Is this a 17th century wall? Is this 18th century wall?
We're talking about something that the basic way of building hasn't changed in thousands and thousands of years. It's the same. And so it is extremely difficult to tell how old any wall is simply by looking at the wall. There are other factors too. The deterioration of our older walls is so substantial in some places that the original look of it is often obscured. So the first thing I look for is any sections that are still relatively tightly bonded to each other to give myself some sense of what the habits of the original builder were so that I can imitate them. One way of assessing that is to look at the way they handle certain kinds of stone. For instance, a stone that has on it, if I could find one. Well, I'll just use this one. It's my example of the day. One of the great things about this piece of stone is that it's got a straight line in it, right? Now, this stone is proportionally large enough to this project so that I could lay it almost any way. I wouldn't want to lay it with this long line showing because then the stone as a whole is too shallow in the walls, not being gripped on its backside by anything, so it would create a weak spot there. So I would want to use this lengthwise. Well, fortunately, I have another flat end right here that I can show, and then it runs all the way through the wall and acts like a giant nail holding both sides of it together. The more of this I can get into my wall, the solider the wall is going to be. However, this is a particular rectangular shape, right? Many builders like to give their wall a sense of stability by making all these straight lines in any stone in which they occur parallel to the baseline of the stone instead of laying them at angles, right? Or straight up and down, which gives an impression of imbalance. And so older builders who had a sensitivity for this would tend to lay all the stones that had a straight line in the same way. And that meant that even though the stone itself was of enormous variety in terms of its shape and sizes, when it came to particular shapes, they would be presented in the same way almost every time. This gives the wall as a whole a kind of consistency. So I would look for any signs of that kind of consistency too. I would also look at how much stone there is. If I could be reasonably sure that the site has not been pilfered over time, and if it's not very accessible, then that's a reasonable assumption. Then I would be able, even if it was seriously flattened out, or if there were huge fall downs in a lot of sections of it, I'd be able to calculate roughly how tall it once was by looking at how thick the base is, how wide it is, and combining that with what I could determine about the sheer volume of stone. In other words, how high it could have gone given the stone that was there on the site. As far as the date of a wall, it's really almost impossible to tell from just looking at the wall itself. What's usually more productive is to check the history of ownership of the land. Who had it at certain times and what their profession was. If you can do that, you can be fairly sure that sometime, perhaps within 2 generations, because people did not tend to create these rough and ready little lean-to type farms, the log cabin day farms. with a lot of fancy fencing. It was easier to throw up stump and split rail fences until you got a little more developed and it looked like the farm was going to make it. Only then did they start to build things that were more permanent in terms of stone fencing. So, for instance, if you knew that your settler had appeared and started to try and farm the place in, say, 1738, something like that, you probably aren't going to start seeing stone walls on that property until sometime in the 1750s or even later than that. This is complete guesswork, but it's not. But it doesn't really, the walls themselves are not going to be much help that way. What else you got? Yes?
I have 2 questions.
Yeah.
First is when you were a kid, this is a serious question, although it may not sound like it. When you were a kid, did you like puzzles?
I liked them okay. I don't think I had an unnatural attraction for them or anything like that.
This is to me like the ultimate puzzle of putting things together in free form. You know, and you don't have a box. You can look
Well,
at the box.
it's matching shapes in that sense. It certainly is. Yeah, you want your stones to lie as closely and snugly together as possible, and this means memorizing negative space and filling it with the positive space of the stone itself.
Which is the perfect segue to my second question, which is, and you can't waffle on me, you gotta pick one.
Okay.
Do you think that building a stone wall is more art or science?
I'm glad you asked that question. I don't think it's art, unless your name is Dan Snow or Jared Flynn, and you are creating conscious art objects, as those two incredible builders do. But they also build practical walls. No, I don't. I don't think it's art, and the reason I don't is because in most cases, certainly in the walls that I have built and certainly studied, we're talking. It's a practical matter. If I write a poem, that's art because I'm expressing something that's unique to me. If I build a stone wall, there may be things in it that are unique to me as a builder, but I'm not doing it as a conscious, expressive thing. It's just a habit. So I think that my answer there is that it's an art. It's a science, not art. Yeah. Yep. Unless I make it art, right? And I make it art by building a structure that has no practical use, that's just there to look at. Yeah. Yes?
Gloves? No gloves.
I don't wear gloves. And I don't, unless it's cold, then I do. I don't wear gloves because I don't know where my fingers are when they are in gloves. And if I am holding something that weighs 150 pounds and I'm trying to manipulate it and my arms are all the way around it, my hands are underneath it, I'm not exactly certain where my fingers are with respect to the contact points of that stone if I cannot see them and I have gloves on. So, I don't. There are 2 schools of thought on this. Many, of course, wear gloves. If I'm working, on the rare occasions when I'm working with mortar, for instance, I'll wear gloves because that mortar is so abrasive that it will wear all the skin off your fingertips in a matter of hours and cause extreme pain. Some types of stone do this too, but most don't. So I'm a no gloves guy. Yes, right here.
Because you mentioned move up and around and ask about this, there's a beautiful stone wall there that has stone steps that allows you to walk up the wall and down the wall.
Uh-huh.
And I don't think I've seen that kind of thing in northern, up here in northern New England.
Yeah, we do, it really, it's a built-in style so that a person can get over.
It's a built-in style.
Yeah, there are various ways of doing that. Not all cultures that build walls bother with styles. I think one of the reasons we see not that many stone-style arrangements in New England stone wall building is because styles, when they existed, tended to be built of wood. And that, of course, would have rotted away and disappeared long ago. Also, a wooden style can be moved from one part of a wall to another. One that's built in is permanent there. And you can't, unless there's no animals in there, you can't just have a straightforward set of steps going up and down on one side. It has to have a baffle of some kind that will confuse sheep. The main reason, of course, that we have that our walls were built to the 4.5 and 5 feet height was to confound a sheep standing on its hind legs and make it impossible for it to see to the other side of the wall. Sheep are wanderers. If they see beyond their enclosure, they want to go there, and they'll find a way. If they can't see it, it doesn't exist. And so this is absolutely the reason for sheep walls being as high as they are. Ironically, cows don't need anything like that height. They don't want to climb anything, and they hate complexity around their feet. And so a 3-foot wall will often keep cows in just fine, where it has no chance whatsoever of keeping sheep. I see another hand here. Here's one. Yeah.
I just wanted to make an observation. When you were talking about art, and science, sometimes when you're walking along the wall, you'll see a beautiful piece of quartz rock has been set right in.
Mm-hmm.
Or some really interesting boulder that comes up like this.
Sure.
And then the wall is really carefully built around it.
Yep.
And it's still standing. And I was intrigued because to me that reflected somebody was doing that and they said, we're going to put this beautiful stone in here.
Mm-hmm.
And they did, and then they worked around it, and it almost it feels personal.
If your job was to pick up rocks all day, put them in a special kind of pile, wouldn't moments come along when you felt like entertaining yourself by doing something a little bit unusual? Now you can argue that that's art, and I suppose under a certain view it is. But you didn't really set out to do it deliberately. It occurred to you because of what was in front of you. And so it's a response to materials. I'll certainly give you that.
Well, I wasn't thinking so much it was art as it was something beautiful. It was a statement.
Sure. Sure. There's another phenomenon similar to that you can see from time to time. In the late 20s and early 30s, when we first started to see the first pieces of heavy equipment, bulldozers, steam engines, that sort of thing, it became evident to most of these towns that we were going to become a car-driving culture. And that meant that they had to do some serious work on some of these old country roads. And so they began to macadamize some of them by pounding crushed stone, often from the walls alongside the roads, into the surfaces of them. And part of this process meant removing the whalebacks from a lot of these country dirt roads. Whalebacks are just great big huge boulders that are mostly submerged in the road, but a kind of little hump like the back of a whale comes up. Now in horse and buggy days, when everybody's going 10 miles an hour and the carriages are really high, who cares? But cars, that's different. You either go airborne, you lose your muffler, or some other enormous damage occurs. So they started this process of road crews digging out these whalebacks. And in many cases, they'd be these great, big, huge stones, right? Well, because they had steam shovels and chains and so on and so forth, it often occurred to them, and this is exactly the same impulse you were talking about, to just pick up this great big stone once they dug it out and plop it down on top of the double-faced wall that's running alongside the road. And so you're driving along, you see this old wreck of a wall, and then all of a sudden in the middle of it, for no apparent reason, there's a stone the size of a Yugo sitting right on top of the wall. And you say to yourself, why did those old-timers want to go to all the trouble of putting a giant stone on top of their perfectly nice wall? But it wasn't put there then. It was put there in 1933 by a road crew bored out of its mind from digging out these whalebacks and deciding to place it there. The only thing is, it's been there now for 80 or 90 years, and it looks like all the other stones in the wall. So it appears to be original intent. I've often seen, too, great big flat chunks set on their sides in the middle of walls. This has a practical consideration too, because if it's fat and huge enough, it creates a whole part of the wall all by itself. But it's also a way of making a kind of distinctive look. So these guys were not immune from entertaining themselves in the course of their work, is the point I'm trying to make here. And if an opportunity comes up, for instance, my uncle used to have a little thing that he did where you would place a stone with a flat line in it on its side. This, generally speaking, is not a good thing to do. But then he would take another one with a flat line and he'd build it into the wall so it's like this, and call it crossing his T's. He could do it dotting his I's too, with a round one and another round one. This is self-entertainment in the middle of a fairly tedious job. It's typical of a lot of kinds of trade work. Most of it, it's pretty visible in stone wall building, but in many places it's not visible at all. It's just a thing workers do to entertain themselves while they're toiling away. Yes?
Do you think you can tell how the field was used behind the stone walls by the size of the stone?
You sometimes can. If a wall is full of tiny little baseballs and really small ones, and there's thousands and thousands of them, you can be reasonably sure that on one side or the other of that wall, acreage was being plowed for row crops or something else, grain maybe, but being plowed so that it was throwing up a harvest of stones of that size on an annual basis. If a stone wall is built largely out of stones that are the size of a human head or larger, chances are most of that stone came off the surface of the ground or very near the surface, and that the acreage was being used for pasture or mowing, something that didn't require the sod to be broken. Those are probabilities. You can't be too certain about it. Sometimes, for instance, they would transport the smaller stones from plowed acreage to another place, like a hillside or a gully someplace that wasn't good for anything else, and just dump them all into there, rather than make them part of the wall. In other cases, where there was a lot of open space, and there's plenty of fields around here near the river that fit that description, they would set up big lines of parallel lines of fairly sizable stones. I mean, the hard to move, hard to drag ones. Just two parallel lines, and make a big trough in between, then start throwing all the other stuff in there, and make no effort whatsoever to create a shapely or carefully fitted wall. They just basically created a trough into which to throw everything that came out of the field. My family and I took part of several of these. We took one apart in Dunbarton, New Hampshire one year, and discovered that they often, in a farm that managed to have some success over several generations, it wasn't enough to create two lines to make that trough and throw all the junk in. It began to fill up and slop over. And so they, instead of reorganizing it, because it was all baseballs and softballs, and you can't really make much of a wall out of that stuff, they would just step out 5 more feet on either side, put 2 more lines of great big stones up. The one we took apart in Dunbarton had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 outside troughs attached to it. It was 30 feet wide. It's just a wall between fields. Now that tells us that farm was a going concern for quite some time, because of all the years that it would have taken for that land to produce enough stone to make that structure. Yes?
Okay, I just want to remind people, if you want to learn more, there's 2 books for sale.
This is a subtle way of kicking you guys out of here.
But we never had a chance to thank you for...
Oh, you're very kind. Well, let me preempt that by saying I'm not going anywhere if you want to come and see my mess. I've got all kinds of information here that I said nothing about that's available to you, but mostly I just want to thank you so much for coming. It was wonderful to talk to you. Thank you.